Hello and welcome back to Introduction to Biblical Hermeneutics. This is Chapter 9, Part 1, Poetry. When many people think of Scripture, they think of narrative, yet nearly one third of the Old Testament is poetry, and poetic language appears throughout the New Testament as well. Poetry communicates differently than narrative. Instead of simply telling us what happened, it often explores what those events mean through imagery, emotion, and reflection. In this lesson, we will examine three areas: the characteristics of biblical poetry, common figures of speech, and the interpretive principles that help us read poetry correctly. Why poetry matters. Poetry appears throughout Scripture, from the songs of Moses and Deborah to the Psalms, prophets, wisdom books, and early Christian hymns, such as the one found in Philippians 2. Because poetry communicates through imagery and figurative language, it requires a different reading approach than narrative. The goal is neither to flatten every image into literal language, nor to treat poetry as vague symbolism. Instead, we seek to understand what the biblical author intended to communicate through poetic form. Parallelism, the heart of Hebrew poetry. One of the defining features of Hebrew poetry is parallelism, identified by Robert Loth. Rather than rhyming sounds, Hebrew poetry often rhymes ideas. The second line may repeat the first line. Synonymous parallelism. Wisdom calls aloud in the street. She raises her voice in the public squares. Contrast the first line. Antithetic parallelism. A wise son brings joy to his father, but a foolish son grief to his mother. Develop the first line, synthetic parallelism. The second line explains or advances the thought. The key principle is simple. Hebrew poetic lines are designed to be read together. Meaning often emerges from the relationship between the lines rather than from either line alone. Conciseness and structure. Hebrew poetry is remarkably concise. It often communicates profound truths with very few words. Poems are typically organized into strophes or stanzas rather than paragraphs. Repeated refrains, such as those in Psalm 42 through 43, often mark these divisions. The word selah may also indicate an important pause or transition. Because Hebrew poets frequently omit connecting words and explanatory details, readers must slow down and pay close attention to context and structure. Let's look at rhetorical in Hebrew poetry. Hebrew poetry uses several literary devices to emphasize meaning. First, we have a chiasm. These are ideas arranged in a mirror pattern that often highlights a central point. Next, we have emblematic symbolism. One line presents an image, while the other explains the truth behind it. Next, we have climactic parallelism. Repeated words build intensity for emphasis. For example, the seas have lifted up, O Lord, the seas have lifted up their voice. The seas have lifted up their pounding waves. The repetition creates both emphasis and beauty. Next, we have figures of speech. Biblical authors regularly use figures of speech to communicate truth vividly and memorably. Simile and metaphor. A simile uses a comparison using the word like or as. A metaphor makes an implied comparison. The key to interpretation is identifying the main point of comparison without assigning meaning to every detail. For example, when Jesus calls Herod a fox, the focus is his cunning nature, not every characteristic of a fox. Now we have parables and allegories. A parable expands a comparison into a story, and an allegory extends a metaphor into a larger narrative. In both cases, interpreters should focus on the author's primary point rather than finding symbolism in every detail. Next, we have hyperbole. Hyperbole is intentional exaggeration for emphasis. Examples include flooding one's bed with tears, or Jesus' statement about gouging out your eye. The purpose is emphasis, not a literal instruction. Next, we have metonymy and synecdoche. Metonymy uses something closely associated with an object to represent it. Moses and the prophets refer to their writings. Synecdoche uses a part for the whole or the whole for the part. For example, all the world may refer only to the Roman Empire rather than every person on earth. Next, we have figures of contrast. Irony communicates the opposite of the literal words. Litotes emphasizes though through understatement. Euphemism uses softer language for sensitive subjects. In each case, context reveals the intended meaning. Next, we have figures of omission. Sometimes biblical authors emphasize ideas by leaving words unstated. Zeugma and ellipsis require readers to supply missing information from the context. These remind us that biblical authors often expected their audience to complete the thought rather than state everything explicitly. In conclusion, figures of speech are not obstacles to interpretation. They are tools that help communicate truth more vividly, whether through parallelism, metaphor, symbolism, hyperbole, or irony. Biblical poets use language creatively to draw attention to important truths. The interpreter's task is to identify what the author intended to emphasize, avoiding both excessive literalism and excessive imagination. When read carefully and in context, biblical poetry becomes one of Scripture's richest and most powerful forms of communication. I thank you for watching this episode of Intro to Biblical Hermeneutics. Again, remember this all comes from a book, Intro to Biblical Hermeneutics, by Walter Kaiser Jr. and Moise Silva. And this is definitely not the end of your journey to studying Hebrew poetry. There are plenty of other books out there that study each of those books alone. There are plenty of commentaries out there. Grab a scholarly commentary on that and continue to learn. And one of my biggest takeaways I hope you get from this is when you're reading scripture and you see a phrase or a sentence that matches one of these figures of speech, recognize that, and when you interpret something, make sure that it lines up with that. So, for example, one of the authors here used the psalmist when he says, "I flood my bed with tears." It would be incorrect to say this man could cry more than any human being that ever lived. That is not the purpose of that statement. The purpose of that statement is to say, I cried a lot, not to make any other claim about the volume of tears that come from his tear ducts. So we have to be, and although that seems like a common sense and silly example, I'm sure you can think of many others people have misinterpreted or preached about. And it's important for us as interpreters to practice identifying these figures of speech. Go back and read them or grab the book and study them for yourself and test yourself, find a line in scripture and just continue to practice reading the scripture and identifying the figure of speech, and then try to say, okay, because this figure of speech is used, how do I interpret what the author is trying to communicate to the audience with using these figures of speech and literary devices? The Bible is a rich book and it was written for our benefit. And so when we interpret it, we need to understand that not everything is literal in the sense of, especially in poetry, there are figures of speech used all the time. And this chapter only covers a very few introductory examples. So it would be on us to go back and study those and just continue to practice. You're never going to be a master at hermeneutics in a day or a week or a month. It's going to take time and humility to say, I don't know everything. And studying these details out will help me become a better interpreter of Scripture. So join me next episode for the part 2 of this chapter, which is about interpreting the wisdom literature in the Bible. We'll see you then.